Before I ask you to make out the cards, let me get into the kind of introductory presentation that I wanted to make. Courses on the nature of creativity, but approached philosophically. There are books on that list, for instance, that are psychology of creativity. Some are psychoanalytic approaches to the nature of creativity. This is philosophical, and in being philosophical, I was going to say transcends, but really is fully immersed in all of the different kinds of creativity. One of the questions that you'll be hearing about in a minute is how creativity in science differs or resembles creativity in fine arts. Architecture has always been the in-between between science and the fine arts. So that has its own niche, its own entry into it. But philosophy tries to talk in a broader way, which makes it much more useless until you know how to apply it. And that's what you can do for your own selves better than I can do for you. So it's merely a course in philosophy, let's put it that way. But I hope it will be of use to you. And it is relevant to all of my previous work. I always start my classes by saying I'm not a teacher, and I give as an illustration of somebody who is a teacher, one of my daughters, who teaches 4th grade. For some reason, she loves being in the 4th grade, so she never gets promoted in high schools, formerly private schools, but then she wanted to have a different kind of clientele, and so she teaches in the Lexington public school system now. And she is a born teacher in a way that I am not. What I mean by that is that she has a talent for seeing what's going on in the individual development of her pupils. And she knows how to elicit from them responses that are relevant to their stage of development, that she can very subtly guide them towards. So she doesn't really impart a great deal of information, though she knows a lot. She happens to be good in mathematics, so that is something she could impart. But the crucial job as a teacher is to see what the pupil needs to learn by himself or herself. And her ability to intuit this is a God-given gift. To be able to understand other people's minds, their thoughts, their feelings, to intuit this is a very special talent. I don't have it. Certainly not in the extent that she does. And so what I always say is, I'm not a real teacher, I'm a performing artist. And the art is the doing of philosophy. And I, like all artists, I do it from my own point of view, with my own vision, with my own perspectives, and my own limitations, because all of art is limited to the personality of the artist. And once you learn how to look at the art, you see into that uniqueness in the artist, and if it's conveyed well and effectively, and such that you can communicate, because we can't communicate with all living entities, insects and various animals and other people. But if you can communicate, well, then you'll see that artist as a successful, maybe even a great artist. But it's always emanating from his or her egocentric concern about certain methods, certain techniques, and certain meanings that are being put into that particular system of works of art. All right, that's what it is to be an artist. And a performing artist is somebody who does it without great preparation. Well, it's true of painters too, but when I think of performing artists, I'm thinking more of another daughter of mine, the one that I mentioned to you, who was at Brown, and who does painting and computer art and all sorts of things, and sculpting. But nowadays she teaches stand-up comedy and is a stand-up comic. Now, to be a stand-up comic, you appear in front of the audience and you put on, and previously she was an actor and a stage manager and has been in film and stage and has written screenplays, none of which she sold as yet. To be that kind of performer, you're presenting yourself in the process of communicating ideas. Now, as a matter of fact, an actor has to rehearse and has to learn the lines. It's not just the actor himself, here I am, but rather a role that he or she is filling. And that's true of stand-up comedy, too. So she tries out some of her things on me, and she works on them, and she teaches how to do this to other people. So it's not purely spontaneous. The version of that I think of as relevant to me is that, in a sense, it is spontaneous. I've never thought through the words I'm going to be using now. They come to me sometimes so fast I can't keep up with them. The reason they come fast is because of your presence and because I feel comfortable and believe in you. And ideas arise in that context, in that personal context, that often I hadn't thought of. And so my notebooks are very often made up of ideas that came to me previously in the class. So I learn a great deal from these classes. And at the same time, it's relevant to my way of thinking, my ideas, the many books I've published, which are themselves continuous. It's as if I have to go on to another one because I'm never fully satisfied with the previous one. So when people say, why do you keep writing? I say it's because I've never accomplished anything. I've never written a definitive thing, like in mathematics, where you can have a proof of a paragraph that really solves that mathematical problem. For me, that is utterly impossible. Everything I write is a function of what I am at that moment. Having written it, I've already changed, and because I'm changing, I get older and have all sorts of life experiences, and therefore my writing is an attempt to amalgamate and make sense out of that, and my teaching, and a good deal of my talking, is an attempt to work at the ideas spontaneously with whomever I'm talking to. Now, there is a structure to this, and you'll see that very soon when I go through the other topics, the main topics of the course, but it's the structure of a performing artist. At some universities, I used to teach at Michigan and Cornell and other places when I was very young, there were clients who had to be taught. These were state universities. The student body usually divided into three components. Whoever got admitted, and without too much preparation, and they didn't know much of anything, so you had to teach them the rudiments. The second group are the students who have some preparation, and particularly in Michigan, but also at Cornell at that time, they were pretty good. But then there was another segment who I thought were as good as any students I've ever taught. I myself have 3 degrees from Harvard, and I was a teaching fellow there, and I sort of knew what the Harvard student body was like, and as a teacher, and they were very, very good. But I thought that the top echelon at Michigan was probably the equal, again, at that time. Now at MIT, that's what I'm lucky enough to have access to, and so I feel I don't have to teach, but I have to bring you up to date with what I'm doing, and so there are certain things you can learn in that sense. But the main idea is for me to be dealing in an original, creative way about the nature of creativity with you, and for you to pick and choose what you want and what you need, and get ideas, maybe just a few ideas, that will help you to go on to teach yourself and to develop artistically as a person in whatever field, creatively as a person in whatever field, whatever it is that is useful to you, and the rest you can forget about. On the other hand, you may be surprised how interesting some ideas, at least, will linger with you. I'll give you an example. I wrote my undergraduate thesis at Harvard on the philosophy of John Dewey. Do you know who he was? He was the greatest American philosopher when I was an undergraduate. He was called the Dean of American Philosophers. He was then in his late 80s. He died in his early 90s, and had a tremendous influence on all of American philosophy, of American psychology, American theories of education. The whole progressive movement came out of his books and his writings, and he even started progressive schools before he ended up at Columbia, which is where he's famous as having been. He had previously taught at the University of Chicago, and there he created a school along the lines of his own thinking. All right, so I wrote the thesis on his theory of value and was very familiar with his thought. 50 years passed or something, I don't know, 35 years, many, many years. And in relation to my class, an idea came to me, and I thought, that's an interesting idea. I should do something about that. And it seemed to me very original. And I was, ready to work at it, and in a sense, willing to work at it, whether or not it was original. But just by chance, I came across in a book of Dewey exactly that same idea that I must have read when I was an undergraduate, and I'd forgotten it, but it got lodged. It became part of my nervous system, part of my, the food that I was digesting and building up whatever the muscles or whatever tissue would be analogous. And it's there. And that's, for me, the touchstone of the educated person. The educated person doesn't have to be an educator or a teacher. It's somebody who has learned how to assimilate what ideas and attitudes and relevant feelings that would have come in this sort of way. So don't worry, what am I going to get out of it, or what am I doing with this, or a lot of it will come that way, but others will come more immediately, and you'll start seeing, this gives me an idea to do such and such, or this helps me understand engineering in a way that I didn't previously. And I'm sure in none of the departments of engineering do you get a philosophical approach. There are programs that attempt that, for instance, of the philosophy of engineering as such. At Princeton they had one, but they're very rare. And I'm not doing that, but this may be useful to you in that way, and in architecture as well. All right, so in order to explain to you why I'm teaching this particular class, I have to tell you a little about my literary history. I won't pass out my curriculum vitae or list of my books, but I'll touch on the ones that are most relevant. And I have to go back first to a trilogy that I wrote, the last volume of which came out in 1988. The trilogy is called The Nature of Love. The last volume was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review and got great many reviews. It's a thing I seem to be most remembered for, though nowadays I look back on that as part of my juvenilia. The fundamental idea in that, which we may come back to later in the course, is to make a distinction between two concepts that... Hello.
Hi.
Are you in the right room? Oh, that's your colleague.
Yes.
You, I remember from... Come closer. Just because I won't be able to hear anybody at that distance. I remember you from the first meeting. Why don't you sit here? You mind? Oh, you're happy you're there?
Yes.
Okay. If you can hear me. I remember you from the first meeting of philosophy of film last term. I don't know whether you're interested in philosophy in film, but like the other one, that probably will be oversubscribed. So I hope you will stay in this one, which is smaller, and I can accommodate your interests. We'll talk about that. So that, let's think about ways in which we can do philosophy of film in the context of the nature of creativity, which the course is about. You've missed a good deal, of course, but let me go on and then possibly fill you in later. What I was doing was trying to position the topics and point of view which are fundamental in this seminar in terms of earlier writings of mine. Very briefly, the seminar will begin with a book of mine that I'll get to, but that's only the first 4 weeks, and after that, the idea is for the students from their own point of view to be dealing with research topics related to creativity, feeling, and imagination, which I'll be preparing you on, that may have very little to do with what I'm doing, because it'll be a function of your expertise, what is important for you, and areas in which creativity of a special sort enters in. So that it'll be like a graduate seminar and very definitely geared to each individual as an individual. So it'll be a kind of almost group tutorial, but I'll be happy to see you afterwards, and each of you, on an individual basis. Okay? So it's a special kind of course, of which at MIT I don't think there are too many, because MIT isn't usually structured that way. So let me get back now to the books of mine that I was talking about. They're called The Nature of Love. They're a trilogy. The last volume came out in 1988, and the whole 1,400 pages in the trilogy are devoted to a key sort of fundamental distinction that I make in the first chapter of the first volume between what I call bestowal and appraisal. I won't go into it in too much depth, but you'll be able to see the point very quickly. By appraisal, I mean something very much like the ordinary use of that word. So there's a house appraiser who goes to a house based on certain training and expertise that only he has, and he asks various empirical questions about the house: how big it is, when was it made, what's the state of the plumbing, how close is it to the schools, things like that. Or is it in the city and therefore in walking distance from where people work, or do you have to travel on the subway or commute from the suburbs? All of those are empirical questions. On the basis of that, he evaluates the house in terms of a monetary figure, how much it's worth. To do that, he has to know what the market value would be, what the market is paying for houses of that sort. It's not a perfect science, but it's a kind of inductive logic, inductive science, empirical science, based on his good faith, his common sense, and his knowledge of the business. Now, my fundamental idea, first of the two fundamental ideas, says that in human relations, generally, we go through this, and we do it all the time with everybody we meet. And I always illustrate, when this comes up in a class, you wouldn't be here unless you thought you could get something valuable out of me or out of the class. It may only be to get course credit or to meet a requirement. We are always acting on the basis of appraisals of the world, or the part of the world, or the people in the world that we're dealing with. And this is a little shocking at first, because in a couple of books I say we are commodities to each other. Now, commodity, like pork and beans that sold on the commodity market in Chicago, or no, we're not. Yes, that's what I mean by commodity, but we're not just commodities. We're more than just commodities. And it's getting beyond the commodityness of appraisal that takes us to the second part of the distinction in terms of bestowal. And for this, my first inspiration came when I read a book by a Protestant theologian named Anders Nygren called Agape and Eros. His idea is that God loves the world with agape. It's a term you may have come across. And the world loves back through Eros. But in loving back through Eros, the world is trying to get something out of God. So you pray to God for favors, and even your love is supposed to be a way of returning to God what God is giving you, and that you may even be rewarded for this. But God's love, according to this Protestant doctrine, Lutheran doctrine, he was a Lutheran, is God's being is sheer love, and the love is pure bestowal, divine, what's called divine bestowal, in which he makes things to be valuable. He doesn't get valuable out of them, because God is perfect, just as people are imperfect and they can't create value. They can only reflect God's creation. But God is the creator, and there are various kinds of bestowal. One, creating the universe. Second, giving people all sorts of good things. Third, forgiving them their sins. Fourth, taking to heaven. All sorts of bestowals that come out of the sheer goodness of God. Now, I have no religious belief of that sort, or really of any doctrinal sort, but I was very much excited by that, because I had grown up, I mean intellectually grown up, not from my parents, with the idea that all religion and all metaphysics is a human activity for making sense out of the world by trying to get beyond the world the way that religion does, to talking about a God. But that one has to see it as a human attempt to make sense of the world by means of this concept of God. So God always remains part of the human concept, but the activity is a human one. And this view is called humanism, and I'm a humanist in that sense. So my excitement in reading Nygren's book was, it showed me how all I had to do was to turn this upside down, to stand it on its feet, or, to stand it on its head, or if I'm right, standing it on its feet, and to show how bestowal is something that human beings do, and that would be what happens in the human activity or feeling of love. So that in love, we don't just appraise other people, we also bestow value upon them. And that is something gratuitous. We don't do it merely to get them to love us back. That would make it appraisal. But without appraisal, we'd never know them. We couldn't see them. They wouldn't exist for us. But in order to love them, you get beyond appraisal and bestow value on them. All right? Let me just stop that, unless somebody wants to make a comment. In the course, we can develop it further, but to get going, for me, would take me many hours and actually now it's more than 2,500 pages. Remind me of your first name. Joanne. Joanne. J-O-A-N?
J-O-H-A-N-N.
Oh, you're the one who sent me the email. I was wondering. Joanne, yes.
But subconsciously, couldn't you be in a state of appraisal, but you think you're
You're bestowing.
Yes.
I think there's a great deal of self-deception, and above all in love. Anything that important, that intimate, that powerful, we deceive ourselves a great deal. That happens, but not if they read my book, because I separate them very carefully. I do it too. But the point is the analysis separates them as different human capacities. Now, I can come back later or afterwards, any way you want. And actually, there's a course I give in the fall called Philosophy of Love in the Western World, which go through this exhaustively. The reason I'm mentioning now is because even at the beginning, I spoke of bestowal as an act of imagination and as an aesthetic activity. And fundamentally, I am an aesthetician. I'm a philosopher of art. But I extend that to include all of human experience, so it becomes a kind of moral philosophy as well as an aesthetic philosophy. But imagination has always been very important to me, and I argue that bestowal is a result of imagination, and that's why love, in literature you find so many love poems, and love seems to be a natural for literary and fictional purposes, also for the movies. It's because imagination is needed for them, and imagination is needed for love. I throw that out and develop it a little, but not enough. I also throw out the idea that bestowal is an act of creativity, because you're bringing into being a value that wouldn't exist otherwise. Again, very briefly, and I talk from man's point of view because it's what I am, but you can change it all around. Don't be confused by that. The man speaks about the young woman as absolutely perfect, beautiful, more beautiful than anything going. You know, he responds to her that way. How does one make sense out of it? Not by thinking that he is deluded necessarily. That's a commonplace which I argue against. Love isn't necessarily an illusion. It's not that he's deluded. He would be if he thought that appraisively, in terms of the eyes of the world or in a beauty contest, she would come out number one. But he knows that she probably won't. That she has certain blemishes, which he then falls in love with because they're her blemishes. There are all sorts of imperfections that everybody has, and the lover realizes most of them. He may also be deluding himself, but not necessarily. And what's happening? What he's doing is creating a new kind of value and bestowing it upon her. And that, therefore, bestowal is a special kind of act of creation. I say that in book after book, and I've never succeeded in analyzing creativity to my satisfaction, which is, as I was saying, what propels me from one book to another, because I'm never satisfied. And that's what I want to be doing in this course, and it's related to the book on that subject that I am struggling with, one of the books that I'm struggling with at the moment. So that's the origin of the interest in this course in terms of the trilogy. Now, after that, I wrote other books, in one of which, called The Harmony of Nature and Spirit. I went on to another trilogy called Meaning in Life, and the third volume of that is called The Harmony of Nature and Spirit. And in that, I have a long chapter on the nature of imagination. I also have a long chapter on the nature of idealization. Or there are two chapters, idealization, imagination and idealization, and then the next one, whatever it's called, carries that forward. No sooner did I finish that book than I felt, something is lacking, and I didn't quite know what was wrong or why it wasn't. It was all right, I thought, within its limits, and I still think it may be my best book, but I wasn't satisfied. I was invited to give a lecture at Oxford, and as always, I come in, like now, without a script or manuscript that I read them word to word, but I look at them in the eyes and try to see what they need and what they understand, and while I'm always talking about my ideas, which are in constant fermentation. And I talked about the ideas of this book that I just finished, that's soon to be published, Harmony of Nature and Spirit. And as I went on, I was a little surprised, because usually this method of mine of lecturing, well, the way I told you, I get ideas being with you and talking about these ideas of mine. I get a few, usually. And when I'm abroad, I get one or two, because I may have been working over it so much. To my astonishment, the ideas flooded in. really, and I was surprised. I didn't know where they were coming from. Now, after that, I took a plane to Madrid, where I also gave a public lecture, and that was on the philosophy of film. Same method, looking at the audience, and I got the one or two ideas. But what stuck with me was this flood of ideas that I had gotten in Oxford, talking about imagination, idealization, what went into the harmony of nature and spirit. It was in the month of June, and I asked the people my friends who invited me to lecture at the University of Madrid, where should I go to be able to go swimming? And they said, oh, it's too cold if you go to the Mediterranean. The only place is on the Atlantic coast, and they gave me the name of a town, Huelva it is, which you mean just below Portugal. And so I went there, and I didn't know what to find. When I got to Huelva, I asked people, where do you go swimming? And they said, well, you take the bus for an hour, you'll end up at the Atlantic Ocean, and there's a seaside resort called Punta Umbria. And I went there, and it was a wonderful seaside resort with nobody on the beach, nobody there. The weather was very warm, and you could go swimming. And I went to a hotel, and there's nobody in the hotel. I was walking along the seashore once, and I saw there was a youth hostel right on the beach. So I went to them, and I said, look, I'm not a youth anymore, but could I stay here? And they were empty, too. And they said, sure, you're welcome. So I moved into the youth hostel, and to go swimming, I just walked onto the beach, and it was marvelous. That month, I wrote the beginnings of the chapter on imagination. All of those ideas in Oxford that flooded in went into the chapter. And it occurred to me, there's enough. If I could only keep on going, I'll have another book. Well, the book that came out of that is the one that I'm asking you to read, Feeling and Imagination, the Vibrant Flux of our Existence. When I came back home, and I wrote a chapter on idealization, and then having written that, I got ideas for that were also relevant to all of this previous work of mine on consummation. Why do people have imagination? What do they get out of it? What do they get out of idealization? Is it pleasure? But that's too narrow a concept. And so out came the idea of consummation. And out of that chapter came other chapters which you'll be reading. So that there is this constant development, and my feeling that I don't ever finish anything. But what I want, with your help, is to go on beyond feeling and imagination to deal with that underlying concept of creativity that I've never fully come to grips with. But I have lots of notes about it, and we'll be happy to share them with you. In a sense, I guess I'll be dominating the first 4 meetings, and then you take over with what you really want, which may be very different. And then I'll try to steer you to what you might be able to get out of me, given my present state of thinking.
I was just wondering,
Yeah.
in terms of evolution, have you figured out why the human psyche has,
Why
we have creativity? Why we
Well,
have mental-
to ask about evolution is to ask a scientific question. I know very little science. I wouldn't pretend to tell MIT students about science. And though I'm an evolutionist instead of a creationist, I don't have any real sophisticated ideas. If you do, then we can work at them, or if anybody else wants to. But you see, you mustn't expect me to be able to answer all of the questions that are very important. Other people at MIT can help in different areas, and there are various areas in philosophy that I just don't bother with that are very important. My colleagues do that. I say go to my colleague for that. But I'm a humanist with a very special expertise, I think I can say now, that's developed in terms of myself as a performing artist in my writing as well as in my my teaching, and that's what I offer to you. So evolution itself, I'm interested in the evolution of our ability to create. I'm interested in thinking of human nature as a tiny, tiny sliver in the course of evolution. So that when I talk about human nature or humanhood or what it is to be a person, I realize that from the point of view of evolution, this is not the way we were whenever we started, Neanderthal man or whoever, and it's not what will be the descendants of us in maybe only 5,000, 2,000, who knows how many years. Certainly, if our race can exist in 1,000,000 years, I don't think the sun is supposed to destroy the earth by that time. It'll be have developed much further, and I have no information about that. It's just my attempt to make sense out of the world as I experience it, the way which is true of every artist, I think. But I'm a cognitive artist. I think that's the point. Okay? Since I've been talking so much, we could stop at any point that anybody else wants to say anything. All right, if not, before I give you the class cards that'll help me to know you. Oh no, first I ought to hand this out. This gives you the equivalent of a syllabus, except that you see there's no reading on it except for my book for the first 4 weeks. Also, we're on OpenCourseWare, so we're being filmed, and therefore you have to give permission. Could you tell me your name? I can't remember from last year.
Michael.
Michael?
Yeah.
Yes, now I do remember. Michael, this is what's needed to give OpenCourseWare permission. I have to sign too, and it looked to me very innocuous. I don't think there's any risk. Finally, there is this partial research list, which is not a required reading list, but as you develop your own ideas from your own point of view, you might find these books helpful, and they're all related to what I'm trying to do in the course. So have this on hand. All right, let me get a hard candy so my voice does not disintegrate. Where did I put them? Would anyone else like one? It's just as hard to listen to me as it is for me to talk. What I've written out are, I think it's 28 topics related to the book that I'm trying to write and that I'm hoping you will help me with, and that will be the focus of this seminar. I don't know whether they're in any great order, but I'll just go from one to the other. So, number one, the idea of creativity being modeled upon romantic artists of the 19th century. So we all have an image we've inherited of the creative individual living in isolation, glued to his private inspiration, inhabiting a garret perhaps, hating everybody around him because they're all inferior to him, struggling with the great problems of the universe with his hand to his forehead, and in general being a very bizarre individual. It's because he is so creative. One of the great models for this is Ludwig van Beethoven, who lived that way and suffered a great deal, partly because he went deaf, but because he had such high ideals for himself and for everybody else. He was also rather neurotic or paranoid. In the last years of his life in Vienna, when he was already very successful, he moved in 1 year, and I don't know if it happened every year, but the record I saw was in 1 year he moved from apartment to apartment, 26 of them, just picking up and moving. And when he was visited, I think by Rossini, there's a record of that, the ceiling had rain coming in, he was living in squalor, he had a servant, but his life was a mess. But that's because he was creative. Rossini, who was a much underestimated great composer, particularly a lyric composer of the human voice, was sort of entranced at being in the presence of the great Beethoven. He didn't care about all this. He was a genius. He didn't care about all of these things that people may make fun about, and considered himself to be a worm in comparison to Beethoven. Also, when Beethoven said insulting things to him, he took it in perfect grace. At one point, Beethoven said, I liked the score of the Barber of Seville, that opera of Rossini. That's what you should be writing. None of this serious stuff. None of, Rossini was writing masses and very serious operas, some of which are great operas, Tancredi, Semiramide. But Beethoven didn't know about them, but didn't want to know about them. He said, no, you don't know anything about that. What would you know about that? Just write some more comic operas like Barber of Seville. Instead of being insulted by it, Rossini in his notebooks wrote, he was right. Who taught me? How could I possibly have learned to write the kind of music that Beethoven does? So Beethoven was a model of the bizarre, maybe some mad genius. And he wasn't mad, but he is a kind of a genius of that sort. Now, my point is that geniuses differ very much. Mozart was not like that. And that's my second point, the idea of genius, of creativity, not belonging to this isolated, inspired individual like Beethoven, but the Mozart in the play called Amadeus. Do you know that? The movie Amadeus, too. And in the course of that, one of the characters reads a manuscript of Mozart's that he just wrote and handed off to be performed, and there are no corrections on it. It's all perfect, and then he says, it's as if Mozart was taking dictation from God. And that's the second idea of creativity, that we're frail human beings. What do we know about creation? God, especially if you have that religious belief, God is the creator. God is the model, the only true creative being in the world. And if we do things that we call creative, it's like you must be taking creation from God. All right? Now, obviously, even about Mozart, it wasn't exactly right. He did make corrections. He worked very hard on his music. He sometimes rewrote the music, and other people rewrote tremendously. They went through many drafts. Now, I'm the second kind. For me, everything I write goes through 10, 15 drafts. And each time I go from draft to draft, I say, I can't imagine what an idiot I was, and why did I say that? Or I get ideas and stylistic changes that I could never have predicted, and I put them down, and I think, isn't that wonderful? Now I've got it. And then I put it aside for a week or many weeks, sometimes for years, and come back to it, and I have to keep on going and going. And I usually stop for purely pragmatic reasons. I'm tired, I'm bored, there's a publisher, or it's like the book of mine that's coming out in a month or so. I was with MIT Press, and they treated me like a member of the family, so I was very much involved in the editing, the designing, all of that, and making changes all the time. And then it went to the printers, and I saw there are other changes I wanted to make, and they very kindly sort of stopped the presses for me at the very last minute. And so that it's out of my life now. It's printed up. If I were to go back to it in a few years, I'll say, oh no, I've got to change this and change that. There's no end to that for me. I'm the second kind. The idea of taking dictation from God doesn't make sense with my kind of writer. Now, maybe it's because I'm not creative enough. Maybe it's because I am not, as I know, I'm not a genius. But it's a different kind of creativity that goes into that kind of writing. And some of what I write is all right. And I might even say creative in part, or limited creativity. But it's not because it's the Mozart model of taking dictation from God. Bertrand Russell, do you know that name? One of the great 20th century philosophers. The Principia Mathematica, you've heard of that maybe? Well, in any event, he was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century and one of the founders of what is now called analytical philosophy, so that he is a forebear of what I was trained in but don't do, what my colleagues all do as technical analytical philosophy. At a certain point in his tremendous productivity, he said he taught himself how to go through drafts in his mind, and therefore when he wrote a book, he just sat down and he wrote it out and then sent it off to be published because he had worked at it so much in his mind. There it was. I've never been able to do that. I can't. My mind isn't of that sort. Those of you who are chess players, mathematicians, or with mathematical skill, you might be able to do something more like that. I mean, mathematicians can work in pure abstraction like that in a way that someone like me cannot. So I don't fit that model either. So there are these different models of the nature of creativity. Number three, one of the books that I get a great deal out of and we'll be discussing is a book by a man who was very influential when he lived, died maybe in 1970, I'm not sure, called Arthur Koestler, and a playwright, wrote various successful plays. You've heard of Koestler? Mm-hmm. Right. Well, he has a book called The Act of Creation. You don't know that, do you? Mm-hmm. You should look at it. It's a 700, 800, I don't know, very big book, which is almost encyclopedic. It shows the breadth of his mind and covers all sorts of questions and has a theory of what he calls bisociation, which I can go into right now, but not in any detail. And his idea is that creativity involves taking two matrices of thought, which are very different from each other, and merging them, putting them together, so that, let's say, a metaphor would be good for that. I don't know, Napoleon was a peacock or something like that, or Napoleon was a lion. Now, one matrix deals with the animal order, and the other deals with people who are very different. If you put in a metaphor, you put the two together, you say Napoleon was a lion, right? Napoleon was a peacock, whatever you want. You're putting the two together, and that's creative. We ordinarily don't talk that way, but except in metaphors. But to do so is an example of creativity. To go even further, there is a movie made by the great Russian filmmaker Eisenstein called October, about the Russian Revolution, 1917, and there was a provisional government headed by a social democrat named Kerensky, whom the Bolsheviks got rid of eventually, and the movie was made during the Stalinist period, so it's a Bolshevik, seen from the Bolshevik point of view. And in the Winter Palace, where a lot of the action takes place, we see Kerensky walking up marble stairs, and at one promenade, you see Napoleon, an image of Napoleon with his hand in his blouse, in his tunic, another a rooster, and the idea is that Kerensky is another Napoleon. You think a Napoleonic figure, and we have to get rid of him. Just a rooster. You know, these are visual metaphors. But we don't ordinarily think in those terms. Only a filmmaker does. And that's related to Kessler's fundamental idea about creativity being a function of bisociation, the linking, yoking together, as he calls it, of different matrices. All right, now I pick up on that and try to go beyond that on my own. The next is the role of the unconscious. Kessler discusses this, and in psychoanalysis, many people have spoken as creativity being a function of the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious. And related to that is the idea that creativity is a function of, occurs in dreams, that dreams are the basis of our creativity. Because in dreams, things happen that are unpredictable, that seem very wild and very creative, and that's one entry into the nature of creativity. Now, these are two different concepts, the unconscious and dreams, because though Freud thought that the unconscious shows itself in dreams, but let me give you one classic example about the nature of creativity. Von Eugen, was that his name, the chemist who discovered the benzene ring as the nature of the molecular structure of benzene. He had pondered over this without great success, and then one night he was sitting in front of the fire and he fell asleep. And in the course of this sleep, he had a dream, and the dream finally ended up with a serpent, parts of a serpent, which then came together to make the figure of a serpent, and the serpent ended up biting its own tail. And the chemist woke up and said, that's it, that's the solution. The benzene molecular structure is in the form of a ring. And that was that later replicated and found to be a truth about molecular structure. And still is, nobody has overturned that concept, that idea or generalization, whatever you call it, that discovery. Because he was creative in his dream. In the unconscious, creative in his unconscious in a way that he could never have been in consciousness because he was asleep, right? All right, now, over and above that idea, there's the idea of dreams themselves being creative, even if they don't make sense like the benzene ring, because that's where the unconscious is doing the work that is fundamental in all creativity. And that's related to Freudian ideas about dreams and also about the unconscious. But each of these concepts have to be examined. At this point, I can't resist giving an example. Noam Chomsky, whom my old friend, who is my colleague in linguistics and very famous. You all know about Noam Chomsky. In a book I have at home, out of the library, it's a book on the nature of creativity. It's on the list that I gave you. I forget which one it is. It consists of interviews with various people in science, primarily, but maybe also in the arts, who are considered to be creative, asking them pointed questions about their creativity. It was written 35 years ago, and so there's a picture for each of them. There's a picture of Noam the way he looked 35 years ago, very different from now. And one of the questions was, how does dreaming affect your creativity? And Noam, at that point in his life, answers, well, dreaming is for me just like being awake. So if I'm working on a problem and go to sleep and have a dream, what happens is that I work in my dream on the same problem. It's just the two, sleeping and being awake, conscious and unconscious, are continuous in terms of what I really am working hard on at as a problem, which is very different from what Kessler said. Kessler mentions that and rejects it as not being true and argues against it. My dreams are such that I couldn't have predicted. I never have dreams like that. But then maybe I'm not sufficiently creative. Anyhow, recently I said to Noam, do you remember this interview you gave? He didn't remember. He didn't know what I was talking about. And he asked me who was the editor, and I told him. He didn't remember. I mean, his life is so filled with this sort of thing, being interviewed, and he just didn't remember. And so I told him, well, in this interview, what you say is, and I told him what I just told you, and I said, is that true? Is that the way you still work? And was it true then? And he laughed and said, it's certainly not true of me now, and I don't know what I was saying then. So I don't know what emphasis to put upon this very interesting comment and evidence of a very creative person. That's one of the things we could explore. Next, the question is, how is creativity related to imagination? Well, this is something next week I want to talk with you about once you've read my chapter on imagination. As you'll see, it's based on the earlier chapter in the earlier book, but enough is enough. If you just read that one chapter in Feeling and Imagination, that'll get us going. And if you want to go back to the other, you can find that in the library, Harmony in Nature and Spirit. That's all right. And 6 is the relationship to idealization, which is also what you'll read the week afterwards. And I can just say one thing now. The word idealization is very ambiguous. Sometimes when we use the word, we mean something that's saying something that is false. Because let's say someone says to you, do you remember that girlfriend of yours or that boyfriend of yours you knew when you were in high school? You might say, oh, she was terrific, she was this, she was that. And those who knew her are a little surprised, and they might say, oh, you're idealizing your past. In other words, it's a falsification. She really isn't that. That's one way we use the word idealization. That's not what I mean. Another way of using it is the Freudian way. And when Freud uses the word idealization, and if you're interested, I can direct you to things I've written about Freud on idealization, but I don't want to go into it too much now. What he means is when people are emotionally attached, like in love, it's part of his philosophy of love, they idealize in a way that they don't anywhere else in life. But by idealizing, he explicitly means, he uses these words, overestimating, overvaluating, rather than underestimating. Because on the first meaning, when you're saying something false, she might have ditched you, and you might have said, oh, that one. And then, and then one would say, oh, no, you're idealizing the situation. She wasn't that bad or something. But the Freudian idea is that you add value, you overvalue, you overestimate, appraisively, because Freud always operates within the model of appraisal. That's not what I mean when I use the word idealization. Another meaning of it comes out of Plato. Of course, Plato's idea is that love is the search for perfection, for the realm of forms in which the good and the beautiful, which are perfect essences, explain everything in the universe. They're the highest stages of value, and everything we do is a search for goodness, according to Plato, and that's the highest good, and only the philosopher can get there. So for him, we're all idealizing in the sense of struggling to reach the highest ideal, which only very few people, philosophers of a Platonic persuasion, are able to reach. And that entered into Christianity, but I don't have to go into that now. For him, idealization is the search for perfection, and that motivates all existence, and above all human nature. That's not what I mean by idealization either. What I mean by idealization is the human proclivity, the human habit of making ideals, just to make ideals. The making of ideals is something that human beings do all the time, and we may be the only ones to do it, though I want to say in the domestic animals I've had, they also idealize, it's just they don't have as much imagination. So imagination comes into this, and therefore they don't idealize as well as we do, or as much as we do. But many people have died out of a love for country, which is an ideal of duty, devotion to your nation, to your people, to your feelings of honor, to your sense of importance, to your manhood, to your womanhood, whatever it is. These are ideals, and human beings create them. They don't just come out of the ground. We create them. That's part of what it is to be a human being. So the study about the nature of human ideals becomes is a very important theme in all of my writing. I said becomes because in the first chapter of the first volume of the Love Trilogy, the first section, I have a chapter on idealization and try to explain love as an example of idealization. It's one of the great ideals, particularly in the Western world, which is very sophisticated about it, but for all human beings, to be able to love. You know, if somebody on his deathbed says, you know, the truth is I never learned how to love, that would be a great tragedy. A tragedy not only because you think people should learn how to love, but a tragedy is that was for him an ideal, and he feels now that his life was meaningless because he didn't live up to that ideal. The making of those ideals, the living in accordance with them, their entering into all of human experience is a very important part of our human condition. That's the way in which I talk about idealization. And so that's the basis for that chapter. I probably touch on that at the beginning because I don't presuppose that anybody has been devoting his life to reading earlier worthless books by Irving Singer. But this is something I wanted to prepare you for. Next, creativity as one of the sources of consummation. People don't just create for no reason. It's because it's very fulfilling. To be a creative person may mean suffering miserably, like Beethoven or any other perfectionist would be, because you know the more you achieve, the more you know how much you haven't achieved, and the more you know how much you haven't achieved, the more you forget how good you are to have got that far, because you're always striving for something more. This is built into our search for creativity. So that is a source not of happiness, it's the pain that goes into being creative, and maybe without which you can't be creative. But nobody would be creative unless at some point the act of creativity is wonderfully consummatory, wonderfully fulfilling. are wonderfully joyous, maybe the most joyous thing one can do in life. And maybe all joy has to be explained as a certain creativity on the part of a person who has it. And so people who are miserable throughout their lives and don't ever achieve anything will say, what a pity, they never learned how to find joy by becoming creative. They never learn the creativity that goes into being joy and the joy that comes out of being creative. All right, that's why that chapter exists. All right, now let me get beyond the book to talk about a 20th century philosopher who I'm sure you haven't heard of, is Henri Bergson, Bergson. And he was French, so his first name is always given as Henri, Henri. And Bergson's philosophy is a philosophy of creativity. His most famous book is a book called Creative Evolution, but it's philosophy, it's not science. And in other books, throughout his books, particularly one that I'm especially fond of, called The Two Sources of Religion and Morality, he makes a distinction between two ways of living, one of which is through intelligence and the other of which is through intuition. So that intelligence breaks the world up into little pieces, and all analysis, like in science, is fundamentally based on that. The other sees things in a flash intuitively. And in the case of morals, there is what he calls the closed society, in which there are fixed rules which you learn how to live up to. So if you go through the red light, you get a ticket, and that teaches you. If you get so mad at somebody you murder him, that's said to be immoral because there's a rule that you have to learn, which is you mad as you are, you mustn't murder your enemy. I mean, unless it's in warfare where there are different rules. But this kind of closed society conveys the nature of morality in terms of rules that are related to intelligence and analysis. But there's another way of living, which the saint does, which the great ethical hero does, and he has a vision. He just sees things, and he spontaneously, intuitively knows what to do. Bergson has an aesthetics, which comes out in a book of his called Laughter, and the artist comes into that too. It's on the nature of humor. But it's really a philosophy of art. That distinction occurs there too. And one other topic would be, does creativity lend itself to one or another of these Bergsonian categories? A book I published the same year that Feeling and Imagination came out, 2001, is called Explorations in Love and Sex, and in that I have a long chapter on Bergsonian ideas about intuition as a basis for identification, why we identify with other people, or what in the 19th century would have been called sympathetic, sympathetic identification, that we sympathize with each other. So it explains the nature of sympathy, compassion, how you put yourself in somebody else's position, how you can feel what it is to be another person, and how this is the basis of all morality and all creativity. That's the 19th century idea, but Bergson carries it out in his own way, and I attack Bergson by proposing a different way of dealing with these concepts. The next idea, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to get. It's an hour and a half. At any moment, we could take a break, so tell me. Well, I'll go on for a few more minutes, and then we'll talk more about time and structure and how we want to proceed. But I'm only on number 9, but it doesn't matter. creativity as a search for perfection. That comes right out of Plato, that the creative person doesn't put up with second best. He wants to have things just right. He wants to create, and one reason he creates is because he's aware of how imperfect the world is. So the artist and the creator of a system of thought, scientific or otherwise, wants to create something that is perfect in a way that nothing in life is. And I think that's very closely related to the nature of mathematical creativity, because mathematics is by nature abstract. Michael, did I ask you what your field is? I think I've forgotten.
Yeah, I'm computer science.
Computer science.
So,
You didn't tell me today, did you? Okay, so I hadn't forgotten. I'm glad. Well, with all of you, you know the nature of mathematics, that it's based on pure abstractions. Well, being pure, it's not like the world, the real world. It's a kind of perfection. It's what the real world would be like if it were immaterial and based on concepts that a mathematician can manipulate to in abstraction and with a concern about perfect purity and pure perfection. So that too becomes a theory about the nature of creativity. And my question is that what the world is like? I hadn't thought about this very much until I began working on the book that I told you about that's coming out this next month or so. It's called Three Philosophical Filmmakers, Hitchcock, Welles, Orson Welles, you all know Hitchcock, Orson Welles, and Jean Renoir. You probably don't know. Does anybody know the films of Jean Renoir, whom Orson Welles called the greatest filmmaker? He was French, and he's very well known, revered in France. He died some time ago, 20 years ago maybe. What was it, 1979, 1980? But he's still remembered as one of their greatest. And one reason I wanted to write about him, besides my loving his work, is that he wrote a good deal of film theory in a book. It's collected in a book called Renoir on Renoir. Oh, he's the son of the painter, not Pierre-Auguste Renoir, but his son Jean Renoir. And in on Renoir and Renoir, he says in one place, the big trouble with the modern world and its mediocrity is that everybody is in search of perfection. And I was startled. Well, isn't everybody? Plato says he is. It is the modern idea. And what's wrong with that? Are we supposed to be slipshod and not do the best we can? And Renoir has this marvelous discussion, which sort of took the veil off my eyes. I suddenly saw things differently, and how brilliant and right he is. He says, if you want to be perfect, what you do is you limit yourself to something that lends itself to that. And for him, that's the danger in technology. He writes a great deal about the danger to human nature, human values of technology. Because he says by its very nature, technology is always limited to one abstract aspect, though it's not purely abstract, it's related to material world, that we can improve, that we can make perfect. But the world is not like that. Human beings are creatures of feelings and emotions and ideas, and they're finite. We are all imperfect. The world is imperfect. What one has to do is to transcend the search for perfection and to learn how to live with imperfection. He is not against technology. In fact, he says in one place, you know why my father was such a great painter? It's because, and why the School of Impressionism came into existence when it did in the middle of the 19th century, it's because technology discovered a way of transporting paints. Before, paint was always produced in great big jars, and so a painter couldn't move them. You had to work in the studio. Then through technology, somebody created a way of putting them into the little tubes or little pots. And so a painter could put all the tubes he wanted into a knapsack and go off into the country and paint the landscape. And out of that came landscape painting and Impressionism. And that's wonderful. That's the way to use technology. The danger is when technology takes over and fools you into thinking that you're really achieving something because you can do it better than anyone else. You can do it to perfection, so that you become a tech nerd. Is that? Well, no, it's not just. There's another phrase. A tech. Anyway, you get the idea. You become a techie who thinks that the mission in life for any creative person is to cut down the time for getting your email, or get a system that works faster than any other. That's wonderful, and you know, I too would like to have instantaneous email without paying for DSL. That's marvelous, and I love the technology of my computer. The danger is, if you do nothing but that, then you're missing out on a good deal of what makes life worth living. And I began to see this discussion of Renoir as a really very important insight into the nature of creativity. So that's what's number 9. He says, you know, if you're a painter and you want to be creative, you can be like the academic painters, the court painters, the historical painters, who are so boring, who give you scenes that show armies in the field, or some official occasion, some official painting, because they could make a hand to perfection. They could make a sword looking just like a sword, and wonderfully realistic, perfect. Who would question that this sword is the best that one can make? But then when you have a painting that's just like that, does nothing else, it's boring, it's uninteresting, it's not good art. But that's what technology makes available to you. The next point is the question of time. Some people say that inspiration comes in a flash. It isn't something that happens over a period of time. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. I think one, in a sense, learns to be inspired, that to be creative, one has to learn how to endure with some problem, some possibility, some idea, over a period of time. Maybe that's related to the fact that I have to go through all those drafts, because I change. Every time I make a draft or think of something, I've changed. And therefore, when I go back to it, it doesn't look to me like anymore. To me, it doesn't look like me anymore. And in that process of living in time, I learn what it is that I need to do in order to be creative to whatever extent I'm able. So that if you're uninspired, you can't be creative, but you mustn't hope to be inspired in a flash. There may be occasional flashes, but they're isolated, and the use of them takes time, and so one has to learn has to discover what's the relation with learning through time and being creative in terms of whatever it is you're dealing with. Now, when I started talking about this last year in the class, I went on in the way that I do, and it occurred to me what I'm really dealing with here is a theory of education. This is a philosophy of education. So I wrote it all out in my notes, and that's just what it is. It's a philosophy of education. How do we learn? Oh, because that will take time. How does time affect our ability to learn? And if you know how time affects learning, then you will know how it is that one can teach. And what I ended up with is where I started with those of you who are here. I'm not a teacher, because all I can do is help my students learn for themselves by seeing how I've learned. Maybe that's my kind of teaching, but it's not as if I have a message to impart. In the case of engineering and a great deal of science, you have to teach that way, not my way. If you taught my way, the bridge would fall down time and again. You've got to learn what has been established on the basis of a lot of experience, experimentation, trial and error by people who are highly trained to be expert in that field. And the student inevitably at some point comes in as a blank sheet, the tabula rasa, and the teacher gives him information. That's great, that's wonderful. It's a different kind of teaching from anything that I do, or as I think most philosophers, when they're doing philosophy. And it enables you to teach yourself whatever you want to know by learning from the experience of somebody who has gone through this, but won't be directly imparting his truths to you, but rather the capacity to find your own truths. All right? Well, there's a lot more to be said, so we'll come back to it. Next, in the book I mentioned, The Harmony of Nature and Spirit, I have several chapters on happiness, nature of happiness, one of which is called Beyond the Suffering in Life, I think it is. It's the first of several chapters that end up with a theory of happiness. And what I developed there is the idea that what's fundamental in happiness is the ability to accept ourselves as vegetative creatures, not just rational thinking, conceptual creatures, but as vegetative, as sort of walking plants, mobile plants, and that other plants, trees, are sort of stable vegetables, whereas we're mobile vegetables. By that, I don't mean that we're nothing but that, but that is fundamental in us. And I always point out, at this moment and throughout my life, through most of my life, there are vegetative processes going on, digestive processes going on in me, which I'm not at all aware of. And without them, I wouldn't exist. But they are what I am, in part. It's only a question of whether you accept yourself as vegetative or feel embarrassed by that, or for religious reasons consider that an evil, or the body that is the basis of vegetation, consider it evil or harmful or less than ideal, and to be contrasted with something else that you call spiritual or soulful. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. I think you can go beyond the vegetative, but unless you accept yourself as a vegetative being, you're not probably going to be very happy in the world. So that becomes the basis of those chapters that leads on to a lot of other things on the nature of happiness. But the idea that since has occurred to me is what I'm really talking about is the nature of creativity, because creativity would require a kind of acceptance of yourself. And what is the nature of that acceptance? And then that takes me into all sorts of analyses, one of which I'll just touch on, which is Nietzsche's idea of Superman. The Superman is somebody who accepts himself, who has a kind of self-love that has often been denigrated. The great enemy that Nietzsche attacks all the time is Christianity. His father was a Protestant minister, and his attack on Christianity was somehow related to his emancipation from parental influence, I'm sure. But in any event, he attacks Christianity because Christianity tells us to think in the spirit, in terms of our soul as something separate from the body, whereas Nietzsche wants to teach people how to enjoy life, to enjoy all of life and all of being. And that's what he means by the Superman. Above all, the Superman, as it turns out, people realize this after he's dead because the fragments that show what he was going towards hadn't yet been published. The Superman is the artist. The artist is the person who truly enjoys being alive, and he does this because he loves being what he is. Self-love then gets to be this activity that is essential for enjoying life and for being an artist. And though Nietzsche doesn't develop it, and that I haven't got around to developing it well enough, is that that's what happens in creativity. To be creative, you have to have enough self-assurance, confidence, self-love, that you will then go ahead and do something which the rest will see as being very original, very creative, but you're really showing yourself forth. That's my point. And the point there is that this is different from being selfish, which is another concept, and it isn't guaranteed that you're going to be creative, but creativity will somehow be related to that, and that's what we need to work at. When I was coming over, I thought of something, which is, and let me just throw it out, and I'll be repeating myself a lot, I guess. Herbert von Karajan, you know who he is? You know who's the great conductor? Oh, you were nodding. You don't know. He was a great orchestra conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. He died, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. When at his height, he and Leonard Bernstein were considered the two greatest conductors in the world. They're very different, but von Karajan was a very great conductor. And someone asked him in an interview that I saw on television, when you're conducting, aren't you afraid that suddenly the orchestra will fall apart, that there are these difficult coordinations that you as the conductor are trying to elicit out of them, that it won't work somehow all of a sudden? Isn't it always precarious? And he said, oh yes, it is always precarious, who can tell? But when I was young, my father taught me how to ride a horse. And here I was, this young fellow, and I think he taught him how to do hurdles, how to jump hurdles with a horse. And here was this great big animal that I was sitting on top of, and he could have run away with me, he could have done anything. He could have rolled over and killed me or fallen, anything could have happened. But then I learned that at the moment that you want the horse to do something like jump a hurdle, all you have to do is to sort of give yourself to the experience. You have to accept your involvement in this. You have to have faith in the horse. And if you have that kind of faith in the horse and faith in yourself as a horseman, then it'll happen. He will jump the hurdle. And the same thing is true about the orchestra, that I conduct with a great deal of this feeling that I know what I'm doing, this self-confidence, self-mastery, and of course, particularly with the Berlin Philharmonic, which were very, very highly trained. They were traditionally and up to the present exquisite, masterful musicians, everybody in that orchestra, because they could have done it probably without von Karajan at the end. He had trained them so much. But in any event, he had this faith, which is based on self-confidence, and I think that's what Nietzsche was talking about for the Superman. The Superman shows himself forth. He knows where he belongs in the world, and he goes, and that's fundamental in creativity. And the creativity of von Karajan, I think, is related to that. Next, the idea that creativity is a function of problem solving. All of you at MIT live in terms of problem solving. A good deal of analytical philosophy consists in the creation of abstract philosophical problems as problems, and then the philosophizing and analysis consists in a kind of problem solving. So it's sort of a mimicry of what you do as scientists in problems, having problem sets and organizing scientific thinking in terms of the solving of problems. My own feeling is that this gets at the nature of creativity from the wrong angle, that problem solving makes the experience look purely cognitive. And out of this arises not just cognitive science, which is a great development that MIT is especially can be proud of because so much of it happened here, but as a philosophy. And that I think is wrong, that the creativity that goes into science, even cognitive science, is more than just cognitive. It's a function of the entire organism. It's not the mind operating in isolation. It's not the mind as a direct expression of the brain. The brain exists in a body. The body is vegetative, motor, animal, also cognitive. It's not just simply a function of what's happening in the brain, though the brain is the pilot and very important in many ways. One needs a more holistic view of creativity in order to explain it, and that is not given if you're thinking only in terms of problem solving as the nature of creativity. This doesn't denigrate the importance of problem solving. That's one of the ways in which, in the doing of that, you can be creative or uncreative. But if you are creative, it's because you're doing more than just problem solving. Your whole organism is engaged in that. Does that make sense? Well, we'll talk now. 13. The expressiveness of speech as an element in creativity. There is a line in a famous poem by Thomas Gray in the 18th century about mute inglorious Miltons. You know that phrase perhaps? Mute inglorious Miltons. Milton was the great early 17th century poet, Paradise Lost. And Gray's point is, who knows how many Miltons existed, but they never learned how to write or read, and so they're mute. They didn't learn how to act as poets, and they're inglorious because you'll never have heard of them. They could be a farm boy or a butcher boy or something like that. But still, they could be geniuses without us knowing it. And so they're mute, inglorious geniuses like Milton. Well, I'm sure there are geniuses who died too young or never were given a chance to bring out their genius. That's the importance of egalitarian universal education, and that's what I believe is my religion, the importance of democracy as an acceptance of every human being. And it's a slogan that's used now. It is no child left behind. As a matter of fact, it doesn't work out that way. But being true to that for me, that's the ideal. From being really true to that is, for me, a religious devotion, in which I'm imperfect, of course, but that means a great deal to me. But it doesn't follow from that just being mute and inglorious will make you into a Milton or will explain creativity. Creativity comes from something else, and it itself, there may be at least a kind of creativity results in the ability to express. So that brings in the aesthetic question relevant in the philosophy of art. What is the nature of expression? And that's an enormous problem, and I really will say only one line about it. We talk about music expressing feelings. What do we mean by that? Creativity may be a function of expression, but then one has to show how. And as I say, I shouldn't try to open that can of worms at the moment.
We only have a few minutes left, so.
Pardon?
We only have a few minutes left, so.
Okay. Oh, it's almost 4 o'clock. Then why don't I stop right there? That'll give you an idea of some of the topics. Now, my hope was, instead of my talking endlessly, which I'm perfectly able to do, but shouldn't, it would help if each of you took one chapter of my book and read it. All of you, I hope, will read it. And you'll find that the writing, the style is very, very accessible, and particularly with the preparation I've been giving you. And the chapters are short, so there isn't too much to read. But so I expect each of you to do it each week by week. But if one of you could take a special responsibility and really think hard about how to tear it apart, how to attack me, how to show its inadequacies, all of which can be done, I assure you. And I will learn, because that's the only way you learn. I say attack to be humorous, but I think it's only by being criticized that you really make any advances in life. If you're attacked maliciously, that's no good. But if somebody really can show you where you go wrong or where you might reconsider, that's the way you develop. And that's, in my own case, as I told you, I've written all these books, and it's only by attacking myself or being criticized by others, so that one has to cultivate that capacity. But it also will help you by, here you have me in front of you, and showing how one can go beyond me or against me or undermine what I'm saying will help you to develop your own originality. I don't want you just to summarize or agree too readily or necessarily agree at all. So is that acceptable to the class? Who's going to do the first week, which is automatic? I'll tell you what's in the first week. There's the preface. There's a chapter called Affective Attachment, which is related to a very important theme throughout the course that I haven't much turned to, and that is the relationship between feeling and cognition, and the whole cognitive revolution that we've just been through, and my suggesting we take another tack. That's affective attachment, and then in comes the philosophy of love, some of which you've already learned about. The second chapter, so there's a preface, that affective attachment chapter, which is either one or introduction or something, and then the next chapter, which is on imagination. That's pages 1x to 58 on the syllabus. So it's not a lot of pages. But I want all of you to think about it, of course, but one person in particular think hard about it, and then we'll all be able to discuss it next time. Given that preparation in the next 4 weeks, you'll have a basis, at least in my way of approaching the nature of creativity from any point of view, and also ideas about the different points of view. And after that, from your own point of view as an artist, a scientist, an architect, which is a kind of engineer, or an engineer, you can go in any direction that you want, and we'll work with you. Each of us, all of us collaboratively, will work together, so that I get some wonderful papers that way, and I feel that I've been of help, and that's what I want to do. And also, let me just give you one brief example. There was, in the course of the later sessions, people are bringing in ideas and talking about them as first drafts for their papers or sketches, so the paper, should issue out in a pleasant way, because we all have been working on it with you. And in the case of one very brilliant person, I suppose I can say a young woman, I was very much impressed. But I said to her, you know, you're presenting a view, but you don't really give enough examples. And that would make the reading and the understanding a little more comprehensible. And in my own upbringing, I mentioned a great mentor of mine at Harvard, a mentor who, well, he's also a great man, but he was for me a very important person for the rest of my life, and very close friend and mentor of mine. At the beginning, I used to say, Irving, you have the mind of a cookie cutter. I was an undergraduate at the time, and the way you should write is you have to give examples. So you say, you throw out an idea, and then you say, for instance, and then you make it concrete. Don't make it entirely abstract. Make it concrete, and that's always stood with me. Now I handle it my own way. I don't know if he died recently. I don't know if he would approve, but well, he did seem to be very pleased with me at the end. But I mean, I haven't discussed this with him since I was at all, ever. I never discussed it, but this affected me for the rest of my life. And so I sort of told her about my own experience of that sort, and she understood. And then she handed in this stupendous, marvelous paper that I gave her an A+ for. And in it, she would say, for instance, and then out would come a very marvelous example in physics. And then a little later on, for instance, and out would come a marvelous example in chemistry. For instance, and then computer science. All of these instances were not only appropriate and developed her ideas, made her ideas, but she had the ability to touch on, and with great knowledge, on all of these fields that it really was a considerable achievement. Now, I'm not saying holding her up as an ideal that you should feel guilty about. Everyone's different. But I feel proud that, you know, in this way, I was able to help her. And we'll all work at the papers, and I think you'll find that a considerable amount of help. So you can start thinking about that if you want, or think about it as you're reading the chapters of my book. But is it acceptable that we start that way and proceed that way? And then the presentations. Now, who's going to give the first presentation? I'm getting a pen to write down. Oh no! Wait a minute! I can't let you go. Before that, we have to discuss how long we're going. I think it's in the catalog. It's a 3-hour course. We can run it any way we want since it's a seminar, and in fact, often people wanted to stay 3 hours, and sometimes we would go on for 2.5 to 2 hours and 30 minutes. And when you take the intervals, you know, a class at MIT is not for 60 minutes. It's 50 minutes really, 1 hour before and 1 hour after the hour. So if you subtract that, it's really 2.5 hours. So we can be very flexible about that. Is that amenable to the schedule of everybody? That's why I wanted to, pardon? We have this room from 2 to 5. Can you be here from 2 to 5?
You mean next time? Today
A
or?
week from today.
A week from today, yeah.
I mean, in general, it'll be every Tuesday, 2 to 5. Not necessarily, but that we'll have access to that, and you'll be here and I'll be here if you want me to be. Correct? We can all do that? That's great. Michael?
I have things to do with like 4:30.
You have what?
I have things to do at 4:30.
Tell me what kind of things. Are they really essential?
Well,
every
I
week?
can probably change it around. It's a meeting for my research.
That you have to do what?
I have like weekly meetings with my professor for my research.
Can you reschedule it with him?
Possibly.
Okay. Why don't we work something out, but in principle it'll be all right.
Okay.
And all right, now could What?
My schedule says 2 to 4 today, so I have
It says
to
2?
leave, Yeah.
No, we're leaving at 4 today. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're-
okay.
No, I don't. Karen, explain to me. Is there a problem?
No.
I think in the schedule it says 2 to 4 plus third hour, but that was what I wanted to arrange with you. But if we can keep on going, that's best, because we don't have to worry about the third hour. All right? If somebody new comes into the class who says, oh, it says 2 to 4, I can do that, but I want another, then we'll talk. We'll see. But as for us, at least, it'll be that way. All right, could each of you then, today I'll keep you a little longer, unless you want a break. I don't know how long, but first, why don't we stay, and could you please make out the cards in the way that I will tell you? Let me hand them around.
Just have to leave today. Try.
Oh, you want a pen?
Yeah.
No, I'm
She
sorry.
said she needs to leave soon.
Yeah.
Why'd you sit here, Karen?
Oh, okay.
So what would you like us to
What were you saying?
Oh no, I have to leave now. Like I leave soon. That's
You have to do what?
She has to leave soon.
just
You
for
have to
today.
leave soon, but in general you can stay longer.
Yes,
That's
it's for
fine.
today.
Don't worry about that. I see you have things for me to sign. I'll be happy to sign before you leave. But whenever you say you have to leave, get ready, and we'll stop. What I would like you to write on the card, in fact, if you hand that to me while you're writing, I can sign it for you, is your last name. So Karen, Karen is not your official name, is it? So write but your Lee is your last name. Write Lee, comma. In other words, write your last name first, then write your legal first name, Ji-young, is that right?
Yes.
And then in parentheses, how you want to be known. So parentheses Karen, or whatever it is, Mike instead of Michael, and so on, right?
Joe.
Or Joe, that's right. All right, that way I'll be addressing you that way, but for the records I'll know what to look for. Under it, write in numbers. You're a graduate student. The rest are undergraduates.
I'm graduate.
You're a graduate student. Okay, so if you're a graduate student, write G and then the year of graduate school, your first year, second year, whatever. And if you're an undergraduate, you don't have to say you. Just give the number. Don't say freshman, sophomore, the number, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, or 5, whatever it is you are at MIT.
Is this a grad level course? Is this a grad level course?
It's in the catalog as an undergraduate, but graduate students are admitted, and the graduate students I had in architecture didn't seem to have any problem. Their advisors were happy for them to be taking it. I can sign anything.
Level of like, I might need a certain distribution. I might need an H credit as opposed to just a
H credit for graduate school? I don't know what H credit is.
I have to find out. But it's like either U, H, or N.
Well, I'll do anything you tell me if the advisor approves.
Okay.
And if there's a problem with the advisor, talk to me. Come next time and talk to me. Under that, and in your case, write MFA. Or is it MFA or
Yes.
college? It's not College
It's MFA.
of Mass Art. It's MFA. Oh, good. This is the
No,
first
it's
year.
the College of Mass
Oh, it is
Arts.
College of Mass Art. MFA is
program.
Museum of Fine Arts
Yeah.
has a program too. Oh, I see.
And then
I was-
fine art, but then
I thought
that's the
MFA,
College of Art.
when I was asked whether people could come, I thought it was Museum of Fine Arts. In previous years, people have come from the College of Mass Art. So maybe it isn't the Museum of Fine Arts. Maybe it's the same program that I'm used to, right? It doesn't matter. Okay, under that, maybe you ought to turn over already. Well, why don't, under that, write your email address. In a way, make sure I'm able to read it, because we deal in email a lot. And under that, the telephone numbers in order of frequency at which you can be reached. If you spend all your time in the lab, put that first, but then put your home address or home phone number or your fraternity or whatever it is, right? Under that, your local address in Boston. And if it's a fraternity, give both the name of the fraternity and the street address. Let's see, what else? Under that, write anything related to philosophy that you've taken as an undergraduate or a graduate student that will get me to understand your preparation better. If you don't have any, that doesn't matter. There are no prerequisites for this course. The way I teach, if you call it teaching, the way I perform is designed to be accessible to any person of a high caliber that you all are. So you don't have to come in with any preparation. Now, what else is there that... address, phone number, email, preparation. I think that may be everything. If not, I'll ask you again next time. Okay, now, I remember Sharon, Karen, not Sharon. Karen, Michael, somehow I think it's Mike. No, what?
Nick.
Nick, that's right. Nick and Joe. And whom should I put down as giving next week's presentation?
Where can I find the book? Where can I find the book?
Oh, the book, unfortunately, it's still in hardcover. I apologize, but it's the only book you'll have to buy. Is in the MIT bookstore under this pardon, on Kendall, the Coop, the MIT Coop, under 24262. If it's better if you have it and bring it in, but if you want to economize, I understand. I don't care about that. It's on reserve in the Humanities Reserve Library, and on Amazon, or I don't know, maybe secondhand copies somewhere. I really want you to read it because it's crucial to the course, but I want you to feel free to either spend the money or not to spend the money.
Well, I guess for now, I'll volunteer for next week.
Great. Okay. So I'll put it on my list. I don't know whether any of you want to volunteer for later. The next reading is on idealization. Next week is on imagination and the introduction. Then idealization. March 2nd, it's consummation. And March 9th, it's called the aesthetic, which for me is a category in the nature of all of this, fundamental category. And the concluding chapter, which is called, what is it called? Failure and Success. That's right, I didn't tell you about the last chapters. The last chapter I call Concluding and Success is because I try to explain how people use their imagination, their idealization, to make contact with other people and to establish loving relationships. Consummation is why it is that people go to the trouble, and the aesthetic is the fundamental category in feeling and imagination to explain why life is worth living, the vibrant flux of our existence. Now, what you're going to help me to do is to get from there into the book on creation, all of which I think is relevant to creation, but which has to be reworked. So you'll be getting that and doing that. The last chapter is called, I think it's Failure and Success. And the point is, the burden of the last chapter is, why is it that we're often able to succeed only by failing? And what is the relationship with succeeding and failing? And for that, you'll be reading about all this, and many things come into it. But one thing that led me into this is something that Orson Welles says. Orson Welles' whole life illustrates. Remember, he's one of the filmmakers in my new book. He has a movie which comes back in the interview called F for Fake. It's an essay fiction. Part of it's fictional, but also part of it is like a documentary about the nature of fakery, forgery, which then gets to be a documentary about the nature of creativity. So that's one reason it's so interesting. If anybody wants to work on that, I mean, Michael, for instance, with his interest in philosophy of film, that would be a good entry. In the course of it, Wells, at a point in his life, not long before he died, when he couldn't get funding for his movies, because the first one, Citizen Kane, was hailed as a masterpiece, and since then many people consider it the greatest movie ever made. But it was a disaster at the box office, partly because Randall Hearst, who was parodied in it, decided to destroy it and pretty much succeeded. The next movie was a movie that people said who saw it in the first runs, the pre-release, said it might have been the greatest movie ever made, ever, by anybody. It was destroyed by the studio because they thought it was too long and it was too gloomy. It would lose money for them, so they just cut out 45 minutes of it without letting him know, and he destroyed them, and there's nothing he could do. That's the magnificent ampersand. So he's somebody who started out with these tremendous successes, and he made Citizen Kane at the age of 25 with the unmatched contract that enabled him to do anything he wanted, to be the producer, the director, the cinematographer, everything he could do exactly without any interference from anybody. Now it came a masterpiece. That was the last time anybody let him do that. All right, in F for Fake and in the interview, he's destroyed by the fact that nobody will give him money, that he was ostracized from Hollywood, that he had to do commercials on television to raise monies and take acting.
He needs to leave, so.
Pardon? No, I'm sorry. Oh, you have to go.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll quickly end. Where do I sign? Approved by? No, it says advisor. Oh, instructor, right? Should I put MIT under it? It says MCA instructor. Should I? MIT?
Sorry for that.
And the rest, you know, the subject and the subject number. You know all that, right? If you have any problems, any of you, my email address is bis@MIT. Tell me your problems. If you know anybody else who wants to come in the course, have that person email me immediately. Well, you have that, Johan. You sent me an email. And I'll see you at 2 o'clock
Yes.
next week. Right.
Thanks.
The upshot of it was that Orson Welles says, I began at the top and I've been working my way down ever since. And that has always affected me very much. But then it occurs to me that sometimes, and as in his case, he did go on and make very important movies. One succeeds only by failing. And that's the logic that I study in the last chapter of the book. Go, 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 go. Now, have you had enough for one day? Should we stop and continue at 2 o'clock? Or it'll be easier and we'll parcel the time better later on. Okay? All right, so I look forward to seeing all of you. You will all appear on television. Oh, no. Oh, did you stop at one point? Oh, I don't know. But I didn't mean, that's true. Only I do this time, but you will later. So hand in the permission fees, and not fees, the permission, permission forms, and I will see you next time.
I don't receive the permission form.
You didn't receive it? Oh, I'll give it to you now.
So it's just this part here?
It's the same
The
thing.
release?
Oh, can you tell us where to sign? You want me to sign too? Michael,
Yeah, what?
do you want to sign?